Yaglidu. Adam shiji kilan. Doris shdi da'a gilain. Carlisle shichara a nan. Jacqueline shunta nan. Larry shtuta nan. Charlene shu nan. Darren shugu ashlan shida. Walamut shugu shkaye kailanda. Koodi tseldatnu yeshtuda. That in Dena'ina Kanaga means my name is Adam. My grandmother's name was Doris. My grandfather's father's name is Carlisle. My mother's name is Jacqueline. My father is Larry. My wife is Charlene. My clan is Darren. My village is Walamut, and I currently live in Soldotna. So when I took my introductory Dena'ina course here at Kenai Peninsula College, and I was really grateful to get to take it with some wonderful teachers, Jennifer Williams and Andrea Ivanov. I was very impressed in a wonderful way that what we started with was introductions, and that the way the introduction started with was kinship, by identifying yourself in relation to a much broader network of people that you're related to. This wasn't completely out of left field. That was very similar when I worked in Navajo Nation communities, where the traditional way of introducing yourself was to give your name and then to give your 4 clans. And so I had not seen this before, but it reminded me of the centrality of kinship, of relatedness in many indigenous societies, including in traditional Dena'ina society. And so that is part of what we'll be talking about today, is relatives. By the way, 2 quick asides on this. I want to thank, we had one class member who introduced themselves this way in the discussion board, and I thought that was fantastic. And it gave me a reminder that I had not done this yet with the class, introduced myself in this way, and I should have. So thank you to that student. I also wanted to point out, you may have suspected on these 2 points, my clan is Darren and my village is Walama, that may not have sounded very Dena'ina in either case. There's different opinions, I think, on how one identifies one's clan if one is not part of the Dena'ina clan system or part of any Alaska Native clan system or Native American clan system. So one of the ways that I was taught is that one thing you could do is to identify yourself by your mother's maiden name, which sort of aligns it somewhat with the idea of matrilineal clans in traditional Dena'ina society, and so thus Darren, my mother's middle name, or maiden name, as my clan name. And then for the village, one thing that I wanted to do that other people have done as well that are not from a traditional village in the area is to instead use a indigenous village close to or at where you grew up. And so where I grew up in Oregon, the closest place name I could find was Walamut, or Willamette, which is what the part of our town is called. So anyways, I wanted to introduce myself that way, though I think it's a good segue in today's topic, which is relatives, kinship, leadership, social organization. We're going to be talking about how people are related to each other. In traditional Dena'ina society, we're going to be talking about how power was shared or distributed in the community. We are going to talk about who had leadership roles. We are going to talk about how people situated themselves in relation to other people. And, you know, you may have gathered this from things I've said, but I've been involved in a major redesign on this course. So it's not the first time I taught the course, but when I first taught the course, I'd inherited it from the late Alan Boris, as well as Professor Rebecca Lamburn had also taught it. And so I was largely using the pre-existing lecture materials. But this time around, I wanted to integrate much more of my own voice into the teaching, partly because, as a student, you've signed up for this specific professor, so I wanted to have a lot more of my own lecture materials and videos, as well as my own perspectives and thoughts, which sometimes differ, sometimes align with, and sometimes differ. And so I was excited to redesign it. I was really excited to redesign it. And in the process, I also did a lot of redesign to the actual material covered. I wanted to include some more contemporary material so that we could kind of do this thing where the first part of the course is sort of the foundations, right? Archaeology, the history of this place. The second part of this course would be sort of traditional aspects of Dena'ina culture, as well as a bit about Shukpiaq and Yupik culture. So sort of what things looked like pre-Europeans, or at least early on in the European period of colonization. So that was that. So I wanted to have several weeks where we talked about traditional Dena'ina culture, again, also with some notes about Shukpiaq and Yupik communities. And then I wanted the second part of the last part of the course to kind of mirror that part of the middle part of the course, where I'd cover those same topics, kinship, religion, language, but cover them from a modern day perspective, both for Alaska Native people in the present day, but also other groups here in Cook Inlet in the present day, sort of what's going on with language nowadays, what's going on with religious patterns nowadays, things like that. And so that was kind of the idea, and I think it was a solid idea. And so as I started to think about it, I started to kind of think about, well, what are the different aspects of traditional Dena'ina culture that I want to talk about? And I returned to an idea that I have many times when I've taught anthropology classes over the years, and it partly reflects how I was trained and brought up in anthropology by a great professor by the name of Ed Andrus. But I started thinking about the fact that I started thinking through what I personally think of as sort of the questions that every society has to answer. So every society, big or small, ultimately faces some common questions, and that's one of the reasons why we have cultural universals. For all of our tremendous diversity, every society is going to have a kinship system. Every society is going to have an economic system, and a big reason for that is because we face similar questions, every human society. Every human group has to decide a series of questions about relationships. How do we relate to each other as human beings, as people, which gives rise to things like kinship, residency patterns, gender, parenting, which are found in every society, although they may look very different. Every society must answer, how do we relate to each other when decisions or power or disagreements are involved, leading into things like politics and social organization and social control. And how do we relate to each other when stuff is involved, and how do we ensure that people are cared for, or do we ensure that people are cared for on a sort of material level? And so thus economy, an economic system of exchange. How do we relate to the land, right? To the animals and plants and land around us and microorganisms around us, which leads to things like subsistence, technology, TEK, or traditional environmental ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge, right, of the environment. How do we relate to a bigger universe, right? So to powers that we may or may not feel like we understand, may or may not feel like we can control, but a bigger, broader, powerful universe of entities, or perhaps not of entities. That's a question each society has to answer. And so thus religion, spirituality, or perhaps even more generally, cosmology. Okay. By the way, I should clarify here at the start that I often in these lectures will use religion and spirituality synonymously. I'll use them both to refer to the same things. For me, as the way I was trained as an anthropologist of religion, we take the term religion to mean any sort of human thing having to do with the supernatural, the spiritual, the not anti-empirical, but the non-empirical, in the sense of something that you can't sort of put into a test tube necessarily and measure under a microscope. So many, many different things fall under religion. That can be things that we call organized religion, or things that you wouldn't think of as organized religion, such as, the very widespread American belief in ghosts. But I recognize that in modern American English, people oftentimes hear the word religion and think large organized religion, specifically large organized world religion, and therefore we have people that say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? Or they prefer to use the term spirituality to describe their views of the supernatural or of the magic of the universe, or however we conceptualize that. And so sort of a compromise between the way I use the term religion and the way that most people use the term religion in everyday conversation is that I use the term religion, but then I interchange it with spirituality, so people know that I'm not just meaning large organized religion. So anyways, point is, every society has some kind of religious system or some kind of broader cosmological system, way of understanding these sort of foundational philosophical questions. How do we relate to our bodies is another question every society must answer, right? How do we deal with illness? What is health? How do we ensure health? So that leads to healing or medicinal systems in every society. And then how do we do all of the above, right, through the medium of words, of symbols, and thus we have language and stories and symbolism. So again, for all our diversity, sort of all societies have these questions and have these facets, as well as any number of other things I could have listed. I could have listed art. Every society has an art system of some sort. I could have listed theatrical performance, which is maybe not universal, but very, very widespread. I could have listed joking, right, as pretty much a universal human behavior. Even the most uptight cultures have some sort of joking system. And so my point is, as I was trying to organize this class, I kind of came up with all these different topics that I wanted to get into. I wanted to talk a bit about most of these things, or have you do readings or listen to lectures about all of these things. And obviously I couldn't have that many different weeks, and so I tried to kind of clump them together into bigger categories, and the bigger categories I came up with were as follows: 4 categories by which we'll examine traditional Dena'ina culture. Relatives, covering everything from kinship to politics to how villages were organized, things like that. Who has leadership, relations with other groups, all of that. Another category was spirituality, so covering religion, philosophy, sort of the abstract values that a society lives by, all of that. And also to some degree covering concepts of health, which oftentimes had a spiritual dimension traditionally. Living on the land, or as this gets translated on the Kenites Indian Tribes website, they have a list of cultural values, which I love. It's a really great description, and they use this term for like living upon the outdoors and subsistence. So I wanted that as a category to kind of cover economy, patterns of exchange, relationships with the environment, ways that animals were treated, environmental knowledge and beliefs, things like that. And so then, the fourth topic, language and storytelling, Kanaga Suktu. So these were the 4 big categories I wanted to spend some time on for talking about traditional Dena'ina culture. And then for the latter part of the course, we'll do the same thing, but for sort of contemporary Cook Inlet life, right? What's kind of going on with social organization and politics and stuff today in villages, what's going on these days with environmental issues and economic issues, what's going on with language, and what's going on with the religious landscape of Cook Inlet, both for traditional indigenous, or for indigenous groups, as well as for any of the other groups that call Cook Inlet home. So that was my idea. So far, so good. Then I started to wonder, though, which do you put first, right? You can tell at this point that I'm a little bit neurotic in how much attention I pay to my own syllabus and how much I want it just so in terms of the order. But I started to think, where do you start, right? Because culture by its very nature is holistic, and certainly Dena'ina society, traditionally deeply holistic, right? It's sort of you can't pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other, as the old saying goes. You kind of can't talk about spirituality without talking about subsistence, because those are very closely connected, and you can't talk about environmental knowledge without also talking about plant knowledge, which means you can't talk about that without talking about healing, and you can't talk about that kind of thing without talking about language and what we call these things that are out in the environment. So it's all kind of an interconnected, beautiful diversity, and so the question is, where do you start with these 4 topics? And I thought I might start with spirituality and religion. I am an anthropologist of religion. I'm an anthropologist of other things too, but that's sort of what first got me hooked into anthropology. It's where I've done a lot of my research. I'm very passionate about it. And also, I think there's a strong argument you could make, right? As Clifford Geertz says, religion often gives cultures their view of the really real, right? The sense of sort of foundational reality. So it seems like a logical place to start. But then it occurred to me that it is very difficult to talk about traditional Dena'ina spirituality without first understanding a number of other things about the society, including subsistence and fishing and hunting and gathering, because so much of the spiritual system had to do with ensuring a healthy, good relationship with the past, relationship with ancestors, but also relationship with the natural world. So I thought that really goes best at the end, actually. I thought about putting living on the land first, because, what's more foundational than stuff, right? We all got to eat. we all got to breathe. And also, in many ways, as many people will say, as indigenous peoples, we are people of the land. So that seemed like a logical place to start too. I didn't start there partly because on a kind of just a practical teaching perspective, we just spent several weeks talking about archaeology of Kachemak peoples and other cultures, early Dena'ina, and given the nature of archaeology, most of what the past 2 weeks was about subsistence and how they made a living and stuff, because we can't go back and interview people living 1,500 years ago. So I said, well, they've had a lot of subsistence and material culture kind of stuff over the last couple of weeks, so let's maybe shift gears a little bit for a week. And then I thought, okay, then I'll start with language, partly because I'm just really passionate about language right now, particularly with Dena'ina, which is an endangered language. And there's some amazing work going on with language revitalization across Cook Inlet, including things like the Dena'ina Language Institute, based out of Knights Indian tribe here, and some wonderful language classes that are taught here at Kenai Peninsula College, as well as up in Anchorage. So I thought that's a good place to start. But then the final thing I landed on, and what I decided to be the first topic, and you're like, oh my gosh, Dunstan, just hurry it up. But the thing I finally decided I wanted to start with was relatives. How we are related to each other, how Dena'ina society traditionally saw each other as related to each other, as well as I'll briefly talk also about Shukpiaq society and traditional relationships, particularly along gender and leadership lines in that societies. Why start there? Why start with relatives? I think there's a lot of good reasons. One of them is it's how we enter this world, right? All human beings are born. At least until we develop a way for a human being to emerge spontaneously, all human beings are ultimately born. And whatever our relationship is like with the people who bore us, ultimately the vast majority of us do get a whole big chunk of our culture, a whole big chunk of how we were raised, comes about as a family, right? Or some kind of relatives unit, or some kind of situation like that, right? One could say that our kinship system is our first social group. And it can be easy to forget in a modern, industrialized, large society like our own, how central that social group, kinship and relatives, is in so many human societies. In many human societies, you work and worship and live alongside your family, right? So many of the things we have on this page were environmental affairs, were kinship affairs back in the day, right? You hunted with your family, you gathered with your family. Oftentimes healing ceremonies were done as a family group. And so, in that regard, kinship is fundamental to so many human societies. It can be easy to forget that in our modern context, where, for example, here in the industrialized US, many of us move very far away from our parents or from our families. We may talk to them a lot, we may talk to them very little. We may have gone into a family business, but most likely we didn't, and instead have sought our own career path. We may follow the same sort of spiritual and political values, but often enough, the next generation takes a total sort of 90-degree turn away, or at least a 45-degree turn away from the way their parents viewed the world. And so in a lot of ways, some of us might feel like kinship's really, really important in our lives, but it can sometimes be easy to forget that for much of human history and for many human societies, kinship is not just important, but utterly foundational to everything else. So that was one reason I wanted to start with it. I wanted to start with it also as I reflected on the fact that as I've been learning Dena'ina, that's a mode of traditionally introducing yourself, as it is in Navajo society, as it is in many indigenous societies. So it seemed like a logical place to start, right? If that's going to be how people first situate themselves, introducing themselves in a traditional way, then that is how we should start sort of introducing Dena'ina society and Shukpiaq society. So those were kind of my ideas with why start with relatives. So I hope that makes sense where we're at, where we're going. So we'll talk a lot about relatedness and kinship in this lecture, as well as politics. And so that's what we're going to do.